In the previous lecture, we defined what the business cycle was, what the 4 phases of the business cycle are, and then the 3 types of indicators that economists use to help them forecast the business cycle. Now what we're going to do is relate the business cycle to unemployment. So again, we already learned that in the short run, we have to deal with the highs and lows of the business cycle. So when we look at our graph over here, we clearly see that we start out in the expansionary phase, we eventually peak out, then the economy contracts or goes into a recession, and then we bottom out, and then the whole phase starts over again. You'll also notice that we have our long-term trend line right here. In other words, in the long run, the economy tends to grow. GDP will rise, which is why you'll notice that our trend line is just slowly increasing. So in the long run, we know the economy experiences long-term economic growth. It's just in the short run that we have to deal with the highs and lows of the business cycle, the pattern of real GDP rising and falling. Now, the reason why we say unemployment would be directly reflected in the nation's reoccurring periods of prosperity and recessions is because of the direct relationship between unemployment and the business cycle. In other words, historically, we can see that when we are in the expansionary phase of the business cycle, meaning that real GDP is rising, output is increasing, generally firms are hiring more people, therefore the unemployment rates tend to go down. And then the opposite occurs when we are in a recession, or again what we call the contractionary phase of the business cycle. When we are in the contractionary phase of the business cycle, firms are decreasing their output, which is why real GDP is falling, and therefore they tend to start laying workers off and unemployment rises. So in other words, we can see the direct relationship between the business cycle and the unemployment rates that take place in the economy. Now, in order to measure these changes in employment, we use what's called the unemployment rate, and everybody is probably familiar with hearing that term. All the unemployment rate is a measurement of the percentage of the labor force that is not currently working. Now, the labor force is not the same thing as the population. That's the biggest mistake I see when students are computing the unemployment rate, is that they're looking at the total population in the economy, which is not what we're looking for. We're looking for the labor force. So by definition, the labor force in the U.S. is defined as all U.S. residents. So you take the total population, but then you subtract out anybody that's under 16, because we don't believe that anybody under 16 should be actively looking for a job. We subtract anybody that is institutionalized. So I mean, that can include people that are in prison, people that are in mental hospitals, people that are in nursing homes, any type of institutionalized adult. Again, we don't assume that they're going to be looking for work. And then of course, any adults who are just not looking for work. So let's say I'm a full-time homemaker who just takes care of my kids all day. Technically, I'm not going to be part of the unemployment rate because I'm not part of the labor force. I'm not even looking for a job, so I'm not considered unemployed. So any adults who are not working and are not looking for work, again, the best examples of that would be, housewives or house husbands, people that are retired, maybe full-time students. They are not going to be included in the labor force. And so again, after you've subtracted out these categories from the population, that gives you the labor force. Another way to think of the people that are included in the labor force would look something like the flow chart that I have right here. So in other words, you start out with society, with the total population of the demographic that you're talking about. And then from there, you divide the population into the labor force plus those that are not in the labor force. So those that are not in the labor force are all of the categories that I just discussed on the previous slide, where we said anybody under 16, anybody not actively looking for a job, anybody institutionalized, they would all go in that category. And then the people that would be included in the labor force, you see, are going to be those that are actually employed, so that's full-time and part-time workers, plus those that are unemployed. And the way that we define somebody as unemployed is that they've actively been looking for work in the last 4 weeks, or technically they're collecting unemployment benefits. In other words, if you are collecting unemployment benefits from the government, then technically that's how we consider you unemployed in terms of official statistics. So the labor force is going to include everybody that has a job, regardless if it's part-time or full-time, plus anybody who's currently collecting unemployment insurance. Now, the way that we calculate the unemployment rate, you'll see over here, is we take the number of people that are unemployed, so this value right here, and then we divide it by the total size of the labor force, this size right here. And that's how we come up with that the statistic you often hear reported in the news as the number of people that are currently unemployed. So for example, let's say that there's 5,000 people that are currently in the labor force, and of those 5,000 people, 10,000 were unemployed, so that would mean 490,000 technically have jobs. Then that would mean the unemployment rate would be 2%. We would just take 10,000 and divide it by 500,000, and we see right here we would end up coming up with a value of 2%. So let's say that I gave you some data like this. So suppose hypothetically the population was 500 people, and then you see that I have it broken down. The number of people that are under 16, the number of people that are institutionalized, so on and so forth. And I asked you to calculate this society's unemployment rate. So again, the unemployment rate is simply the number of people that are unemployed, meaning that they're actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks, divided by the size of the labor force. So again, we can clearly see the number of people that are in the labor force are going to include people that are employed full-time, so right here, people that are employed part-time, so right here, and then of course those that are actively looking for a job, meaning that they're unemployed. So that becomes the size of your labor force. So the size of our labor force is 300 people. And then you look to see how many people in your labor force are unemployed, meaning how many are actively looking for a job. We see that that is 50. So to figure out what our unemployment rate is for this society, we simply take the number of unemployed, which is 50, and divide it by the size of the labor force, which would be roughly 17%. So again, that would be the technical size of the unemployment rate as measured by the government, just by taking the number of people that are unemployed and dividing it by the labor force. Now, the thing about the unemployment rate that we often hear reported is that it may not actually be giving us an accurate depiction of what's truly going on in the labor market. It could be what we call underestimating or overstating what the true state of unemployment is, simply because of the exclusion of certain types of workers. The one factor that tends to make the unemployment rate underestimate the true reality of unemployment is what we call discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are workers that were previously generally part of the labor market. Oftentimes they lose their jobs for various reasons, and they continue to look for jobs, and eventually their unemployment benefits will run out, and they will actually just stop looking for work altogether. So people that fall into this category often cite that discrimination they think may play a role in why people are not hiring them. But whatever the reason it may be, these are people that are no longer actively looking for jobs, which is why they are not technically part of the unemployment rate anymore. When in reality, we know that they wanted a job, they were looking for a job, but because of, for whatever reason, whether it's discrimination or just that there were no jobs available, they eventually gave up looking for work. Or again, their unemployment benefits simply ran out. So according to the government, you're no longer collecting unemployment unemployment, therefore technically you're not part of the unemployment rate anymore. So because we exclude discouraged workers, the unemployment rate again may be underestimating the true reality of unemployment in the economy. If we wanted to get an idea of what the unemployment rate would look like if we included discouraged workers, you would use an alternative measure of labor utilization that the government keeps track of. And that would be what we call the U4 measure of labor utilization. And so the U4 measure does include discouraged workers in the calculation. So again, you can kind of compare what is the unemployment rate in relation to what the unemployment rate would be if we were including discouraged workers. So you'll notice that all we're basically doing is taking our formula for unemployment, but then including discouraged workers into it. So we're including discouraged workers in with the number of unemployed, and then we're adding the number of discouraged workers into the labor force. So going back to my original example, let's say of those 100 people that were not actively looking for a job, what if we said 50 of those were discouraged? In other words, they had, looked for jobs in the past, but they just never found jobs, and so they eventually gave up looking. We can look and see how the unemployment rate would change. In other words, looking at the U4 measure to see what it would be if we included them in our calculation. So again, if we add them in, then what that means is that the size of the labor force is now going to change from 300 to 350. And the number that are unemployed is going to change from 50 to 100. And so now we plug those numbers into our formula for the U4 measure. So we would have a value of 100 people who are technically unemployed when you include discouraged workers, divided by a size of the labor force that is now 350. And you would come up with a number that is closer to about 29%. So again, notice that by excluding the discouraged workers, it made it look like we had a much lower unemployment rate than we actually did. It's not reflecting the true nature of the labor market when we exclude the discouraged workers. Another problem with the unemployment rate is that it does not reflect what we call underemployment. Underemployment is a situation where the worker is employed in a job that does not utilize their full productive potential. So in other words, maybe people that are working part-time but want to work full-time. Or it can also include people that are, working in lower paying jobs. Due to lack of higher paying jobs. Meaning, let's say, for example, that you were a school teacher making $50,000 a year and you got laid off, and you just wanted to find a job in order to, put food on the table. So you went and took a job working at McDonald's. So technically you're employed. You're not considered unemployed, but we would say that you're very underemployed because you're employed in a job that's not actually utilizing your full productive potential. You're severely underemployed. And the same thing, again, if you want to work full-time but you're working part-time, again, you're only producing about half of the amount of output that you're capable and wanting to produce. So both of these are examples of individuals being underemployed. And again, the unemployment does not reflect underemployment. So let's say, for example, that we start out with the labor force of 100, and of those 100 people, 10% are unemployed and 90 actually have jobs. So we can easily calculate the unemployment rate simply by taking the number of unemployed, dividing it by the size of the labor force, and seeing that we have a 10% unemployment rate. Now let's say that a recession hits, and so let's say that this same area, they have two options for this area that has a labor force of 100. The employers can actually start laying off workers in response to the recession. So let's say they can lay off 10 workers as a whole to to be in line with the current demand of goods and services. Or they can just decide we don't want to lay anybody off, so we're just going to cut the hours for all of our employees in response to the recession. Both of them will achieve the same goal of the firm, which is to decrease the output in response to the decrease in demand due to the recession. But you'll notice that depending on what the firms decide to do has two completely different impacts on the unemployment rate. If the firms decide to actually lay off 10 workers, then that would mean that when we're looking at this option right here, it would cause the number of people that are unemployed to increase to 20. So now the new unemployment rate with this option would be 20 divided by 100, and we see the unemployment rate would increase to 20%. However, if they decide not to lay off workers and just to cut everybody's hour, everybody, working full time, everybody's just working part time now. Well, if that's the option that they choose, well, again, technically, everybody still has a job. So when we calculate out the unemployment rate, it's still only 10%, even though we have all of these people that are severely underemployed now due to the cut in their hours. So again, that's why we say that the unemployment rate does not give us an accurate depiction of what is going on in the labor market, because what if you have a large number of people that are severely underemployed? Again, the unemployment rate is not going to reflect that. It makes it look like there's been no job loss, therefore everybody in the labor market is exactly the same as they were prior to the recession, even though we clearly see that they are not. The last factor that is not reflected in the unemployment rate would be the existence of the underground economy. But unlike discouraged workers and underemployed workers, where it actually causes the unemployment rate to underestimate the true, nature of employment in the economy, the underground economy can often make the unemployment rate be overstated. And that is because people that are employed in the underground economy are not included in official statistics. So let's say, for example, that you have like a contractor that gets hurt and he starts collecting unemployment benefits. However, he's still doing work on the side, in the underground economy. Again, technically he's working, but because he's collecting unemployment benefits, it makes it look like we have higher unemployment than we actually do. Okay, so now that we have defined how you calculate the unemployment rate and then the factors related to the unemployment rate that cause it to be underestimating or overestimating the true nature of employment in the economy, let's actually talk about the 4 different types of unemployment that can occur. There's 4 basic types. Those are going to be seasonal, frictional, structural, or cyclical. So let's talk about each one of these individually. Seasonal unemployment is quite easy to grasp the concept of. In other words, there's going to be certain industries that only require workers for certain seasons of the year. In other words, they don't need to employ people year-round. They just need to employ people when there's the seasonal demand for the workers. So let's say we're talking about agriculture. We know that crops are not necessarily grown year-round, that they are just grown and harvested during certain seasons. Therefore, in that particular industry, you're going to have people that experience seasonal unemployment. They'll be hired during the growing season and harvest season, and then they'll be laid off once that season is over. Think about something in regards to where you utilize snow. If you're going to go skiing at Mammoth, they're not going to hire people to run the lifts year round. They're only going to need to hire people in the skiing season, the winter months. So seasonal unemployment is just a normal, healthy part of a dynamic market economy. In other words, the only way to get rid of seasonal unemployment would be to get rid of the industries in which the goods and services are produced based on the seasons, and we certainly don't want to do that. So we don't consider seasonal unemployment bad at all. That should be part of just our natural rate of unemployment in the economy. The second type of unemployment that we have is what's called frictional unemployment. It's also sometimes called search unemployment. And this is just the short-term movement of workers between jobs and first-time job seekers. So again, let's say that you were a college student that worked at Starbucks throughout college, and then you finally graduate with your bachelor's degree in business, and you want to go out there and start looking for jobs in the field that you actually obtained your degree in. We would say that you're technically frictionally unemployed. You're just, a short-term unemployment where you're moving between one job to another. Again, frictional unemployment is not a bad thing. Most people that leave jobs in search of other jobs are generally seeking better, higher paying jobs. And again, we consider that a good, normal, healthy part of a dynamic market economy. In other words, frictional unemployment, again, we wouldn't want to do away with that. We want people to constantly be, striving for jobs in higher paying industries and increasing their value in the labor market. Most people don't quit high paying jobs to go look for jobs where they're going to make less. So again, we consider frictional unemployment just a normal, healthy part of the economy, and we also include that in just our natural rate of unemployment. The third type of unemployment that we can have is what's called structural unemployment, and this is generally caused by technological changes or other various changes in the structure of the economy or a particular industry. So imagine somebody who perhaps worked on a car assembly line for years and years, and then that auto company experienced technological advancements that allowed them to just use robots to do the same work. So that person's job was basically taken over by a robot. That would be an example of somebody who is now going to experience structural unemployment. In other words, they can't just go find another job in their same industry because that job doesn't exist anymore. It was actually, replaced by the advances in technology. And so structural unemployed people generally are going to be the ones that are most likely to eventually become discouraged workers because of the fact that the job that they previously did no longer exists. So they would have to find a whole new, occupation, to go into in order to get employment in the labor market. Again, we don't consider structural unemployment a bad thing, though. Usually when there's technological advances where jobs are being replaced by technology, it's making firms more efficient, which means they're increasing output. GDP is therefore increasing, which is good for the overall economy. So although it may be bad for the individual who loses his job, it's actually a positive for the entire economy. So again, we consider structural unemployment just a normal, healthy part of a market economy. And some economists will also state that whenever we have these advances in technology that create the structural unemployment for certain industries, it's also creating jobs in other industries, generally the tech industry. So, even though we're losing jobs, theoretically, we should be gaining jobs in other industries. So the three types of unemployment I've discussed thus far, I've stated that these are just normal, healthy parts of a dynamic market economy, which we consider to be all part of the natural rate of unemployment. It's the fourth type of unemployment that we find highly undesirable. And that unemployment is what we call cyclical unemployment. And this is the unemployment that is caused by the business cycle. So you recall at the very beginning of this lecture, I stated that when the economy goes into a recession, you tend to see the correlation between decrease in GDP and an increase in the unemployment rate. And so if GDP is falling, that means firms are producing less, and as firms produce less, their demand for labor is going to decline. Therefore, they start to lay off their workers. And so this is the unemployment that we find highly undesirable. In other words, this is the employment that is not being caused simply by changes in the season, changes in, structural changes in the economy, people looking for better jobs. This is people simply losing their jobs because we've gone into the recession in terms of the business cycle. And so this is the type of unemployment that, again, we find problematic. The way that economists measure the value of this cyclical unemployment is what we call the GDP gap. In other words, we want to know when we have cyclical unemployment, in other words, people out of work simply because we're in a recession, what is the value of the lost output? In other words, how much could the economy be producing if those people did actually still have their jobs? And so we define that as we define that as the GDP gap. The GDP gap is going to be what potential real GDP is, and then subtract out what the actual level of real GDP is. And potential GDP, that's going to be the amount of output that we can produce if we are at the natural rate of unemployment, meaning that everybody has jobs except for those that are seasonally unemployed, frictionally unemployed, or structurally unemployed. So here we can look at some graphs of periods where we've had a GDP gap. And again, you'll notice that every time we've had a GDP gap, it correlates when the economy is in a recession. And so what economists do is they estimate the amount of output we would be producing if everybody had jobs, opposed to the amount of output that is actually taking place. And so when we're looking at the first graph right here, we can clearly see that at any point that the real GDP is below the potential, that's when we're in a recession and we have the lost output that we're dealing with. And then over here we can see on this graph where they've gone in and estimated what the value of the lost output was due to those recessions. So notice that the largest one between 1975 and 2002 was $250 billion when we had our short recession from about 82 to 80, or what is that, from 81 to 82. We can clearly see that the economists estimate we lost about $250 billion due to that short recession. Now, before we move on to inflation, I just want to wrap up what we've learned in terms of unemployment. Again, we've learned how to calculate the unemployment rate. We've learned why the unemployment rate may not be an accurate depiction of what's truly going on in the labor market because of discouraged workers and underemployed workers. And then we've learned the 4 different types of unemployment and how cyclical unemployment is the unemployment that generally leads to a loss of output, which we define as the GDP gap. The last thing I want to talk about is just some general unemployment trends that we see, and you'll go over this in your assigned reading this week. What we generally have seen historically when it comes to unemployment rates is that women have historically had higher rates than men until about 2001, and there's some different theories as to why they believe that women no longer have higher unemployment rates. One of them is just the fact that historically women were more likely to face discrimination in the labor market, which would help explain why they had higher unemployment rates than men. But in recent years, economists have stated that women are generally more likely to take jobs with lower pay than their male counterparts, which would explain that, how since 2001 we've undergone quite a few recessions, that in those recessionary periods, men again are more likely to be unemployed and hold out for higher paying jobs, whereas women will go right back into the labor market even if the pay is not as high. Another trend that we observe is that teenagers have always had the highest unemployment rates of every demographic group, which makes complete sense because there is a correlation between your likelihood of getting a job and your job experience and education level. And we know teenagers have the least amount of job experience and the lowest levels of education, which is why they're going to always have the highest unemployment rates. And then also when we break it down demographically by race, we know that whites historically have had lower unemployment rates than the majority of non-whites. In other words, Hispanics and blacks generally have higher unemployment rates than their white counterparts. The only demographic in the United States that this is not true of would be Asians. Asians generally have unemployment rates that are comparable to their white counterparts.